The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before Ayanna as she trudged through the sand, her two young daughters clinging to her worn cotton dress. The sun beat down mercilessly on their heads, but the heat outside was nothing compared to the burning shame she carried within her chest. Every step away from the reservation was a step toward an uncertain future, but anything was better than the hell she'd left behind. Her youngest daughter, Kaya, barely 3 years old, whimpered softly as she stumbled in the sand. Ayanna stopped and lifted the child into her arms, feeling the familiar ache in her ribs where her husband's boot had connected just days before. The bruises had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but the pain lingered like an unwelcome ghost.
"Mama."
"Where are we going?" asked Senna, her 7-year-old, looking up with eyes that held too much wisdom for her age. Those eyes had seen things no child should witness: the violence, the screaming, the nights when their father would rage about having cursed daughters instead of sons. "Somewhere safe," Ayanna whispered, though she wasn't sure such a place existed. Her English was broken, learned from the missionary school, where she'd met her late husband. But it would have to do in the white man's world she was now entering. The desert wind whipped her long black hair across her face, and she adjusted the small bundle of possessions on her back. Everything she owned in the world fit into a tattered cloth bag: a few pieces of clothing, a wooden comb her grandmother had carved, and the last of their dried corn. Her husband had controlled everything, doling out money like scraps to a dog, always reminding her that she was worthless, that she had failed him by not producing sons. As the afternoon wore on, Ayanna's legs began to shake with exhaustion. Kaya had grown heavy in her arms, and Senna was falling behind, her small feet blistered from walking in worn moccasins. The landscape began to change slightly. Sparse vegetation gave way to a few scattered mesquite trees, and in the distance, she could make out what looked like a small structure. Her heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. What if whoever lived there turned them away? What if they called the authorities? She had no legal right to be wandering the desert with her children, no papers or documentation that would prove her worth to suspicious white settlers. But as they drew closer, Ayanna could see it was a modest ranch house, weathered by years of desert storms, but still standing strong. A few horses grazed in a fenced area nearby, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. The sight of domestic life, peaceful and quiet, made her chest tightened with longing. She had forgotten what peace looked like, standing at the edge of what she assumed was the property line. Ayanna hesitated. Her husband's voice echoed in her memory. "No one will ever want you, broken woman. You bring nothing but shame and worthless daughters." The words had been beaten into her soul along with the physical blows, and now they whispered doubt into her exhausted mind. But Kaya was growing weaker, and Sina's lips were cracked from thirst. Maternal instinct overrode her fear, and she forced her feet to move forward, each step taking tremendous courage. Whatever happened next, she had to try. Her daughters deserved better than dying in the desert because their mother was too afraid to ask for help. As they approached the house, a figure emerged from behind the structure, a tall man with graying hair and weathered hands, carrying a bucket of water. He stopped when he saw them, his expression unreadable. Ayanna's body tensed, ready to run if necessary. But something in his eyes wasn't the anger or disgust she'd learned to expect from men. It was something she'd almost forgotten existed: basic human decency. James McKenna had lived alone on his small ranch for nearly 8 years, ever since his wife Sarah had died from fever. The solitude suited him. No one to disappoint, no one to mourn when the desert claimed another soul. He'd grown accustomed to the silence, to the predictable routine of caring for his horses and the small herd of cattle that grazed on his modest acreage. So when he looked up from the water trough and saw the Apache woman standing at the edge of his property with 2 small children, his first instinct was caution. But as his eyes took in their condition, the woman's obvious exhaustion, the way she swayed on her feet, the children's hollow cheeks, caution gave way to something deeper. The woman was young, probably no more than 25, but her face held the kind of weariness that came from enduring too much pain. Her dark eyes darted nervously between him and potential escape routes, like a wounded animal ready to bolt. The children pressed close to her sides, and he could see the protective way she positioned herself between them and any perceived threat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, setting down the bucket and taking a step back to give them space. His voice was rusty from disuse, gravelly from years of speaking mainly to horses. "You folks look like you could use some water." Yana's English was limited, but she understood the tone. There was no anger in it, no impatience. "What?" She nodded hesitantly, then looked down at her daughters. Senna was staring at the ground, but little Kaya was looking at the horses with the kind of wonder that only children possessed. "Please," Ayana managed to say, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. Her throat was parched, and she could feel her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. James moved slowly, deliberately, like he might approach a skittish horse. He picked up the bucket and walked to the well, drawing up fresh, cool water. The sound of the metal bucket hitting the water echoed across the desert silence, and he could see the children's eyes following his every movement. "Here," he said, offering the dipper to Ayana first. "It's good water, cold." The woman looked at him with such surprise that it broke something inside James's chest. When was the last time someone had shown her simple kindness? Her hands shook as she took the dipper, and she drank deeply before passing it to her older daughter. The child drank eagerly, then held it carefully for her little sister as they drank. James noticed the way Ayana held herself slightly hunched, protecting her ribs. He'd seen enough injured animals to recognize the signs of recent trauma. The realization made his jaw clench with anger, not at her, but at whatever had driven this small family into the desert alone. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. The woman nodded, and he could see tears threatening to spill from her eyes at this simple question. "I got some stew on the stove, made too much, as usual." The truth was, James always made too much food out of habit. Sarah used to tease him about it, saying he cooked like he was feeding a ranch full of cowboys instead of just the two of them. After she died, he'd continued the pattern, often giving the extra food to his horses or the occasional drifter who passed through looking for work. Ayana looked toward the house, then back at him, clearly torn between need and fear. "We not stay long," she said carefully in broken English. "Just little food for children. Nobody's rushing you anywhere," James replied. "Desert's no place for little ones when the sun's this high. You're welcome to rest in the shade, get some strength back." He gestured toward the covered porch that ran along the front of the house. It was modest, just a few wooden chairs and a small table where he sometimes sat in the evenings. But it offered blessed relief from the brutal afternoon sun as they walked toward the house. James noticed how the woman kept glancing at him sideways as if she couldn't quite believe he meant what he said. Her wariness cut him deeply. What kind of treatment had she endured to make simple human kindness seem so foreign? The little girls stayed close to their mother, but he caught the older one looking at his horses with interest. "You like horses?" he asked Sina, who immediately looked down and moved closer to her mother. She like animals," Ayana said softly, "but we not supposed to." She trailed off, unable to find the English words to explain the restrictions and fears that had governed their lives. "Well," James said, settling into his chair and keeping his voice casual, "horses don't care much about what folks are supposed to do. They just care if you're kind to them." As he went inside to dish up bowls of beef stew, James found himself moving carefully, aware that every action was being watched and evaluated by a woman who had learned to expect the worst from life. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to be around people, especially people who'd been hurt. But something about this small family called to the part of him that Sarah had loved best, the part that couldn't turn away from suffering, that had to try to help even when it would be easier to look away. When he returned with the food, he saw Ayana had positioned herself where she could see all approaches to the porch, still ready to run if necessary. The sight made him more determined than ever to prove that not everyone in the world wanted to hurt her. 3 days had passed since Ayana and her daughters had arrived at the ranch, and James found himself adjusting to their presence with surprising ease. He'd offered them the small spare room that had once been intended as a nursery back when he and Sarah had dreamed of filling their home with children. The irony wasn't lost on him that it had finally found its purpose. It's just not in the way they'd imagined. Ayanna was slowly beginning to relax, though she still flinched when he moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. She insisted on working for their keep, despite his protests that she should rest and recover. Every morning she would appear at dawn to help with the horses, her movements careful but capable. She had a natural way with animals that impressed him, speaking to them in Apache words that seemed to calm even his most temperamental mare. She was hurt bad, Sina told him one afternoon, while her mother was inside preparing their simple lunch. The 7-year-old had begun to open up to James, her natural curiosity overcoming her learned caution. Papa would get angry when she couldn't make boys. He said it was her fault. We were only girls. The casual way the child spoke about such cruelty made James's stomach turn. He knelt down to her level, choosing his words carefully. Your mama didn't do anything wrong, Sina. Having daughters is a blessing, not a curse. Any man who can't see that is the one with the problem. Senna studied his face with those two wise eyes. You mean that? Mean that? James said firmly. Your mama is one of the strongest people I've ever met. It takes real courage to protect your children the way she did. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, James noticed Ayanna's posture had changed slightly. She still sat with her back straight, ready to react to any threat. But her shoulders weren't quite as rigid as they'd been those first days. Mr. James, she said quietly, using the name she'd settled on for him. Why you help us? We nothing to you. The question caught him off guard, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it revealed just how little kindness she'd experienced in her life. You're not nothing, he said, keeping his voice gentle. We're a mother trying to protect her children. That means everything. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, watching Kaya chase fireflies in the twilight, while Sina helped with the evening chores. My husband, he say Apache women worth nothing to white men? Say we only good for work and other things? She couldn't meet his eyes as she spoke. Your husband was wrong about a lot of things, James replied. He wanted to say more, too. Tell her that any man who would beat a woman for something as natural as giving birth to daughters was no man at all. But he sensed that too much anger in his voice might frighten her. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. James would handle the heavier ranch work, while Ayanna took care of the domestic tasks, though she insisted on helping with the animals whenever possible. She was teaching herself to cook white man's food by watching him, adding her own touches. That made even simple meals taste better than anything he'd managed on his own. The children were thriving. Kaya had lost that hollow look in her cheeks, and her laughter could be heard throughout the day as she played with the barn cats or helped collect eggs from the few chickens James kept. Sina was more reserved, but she'd begun asking him questions about the horses and even tried her hand at basic reading using an old Bible he'd found. One evening, James came back from checking the cattle to find Ayanna sitting on the porch steps, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, and he could hear soft sobs that she was trying to muffle. The children were inside, presumably asleep, so she'd allowed herself this moment of private grief. He sat down beside her, not speaking, just offering his presence. After a few minutes, she looked up, her eyes red with tears. I dream about him, she whispered. My husband. He find us. He take children. He hurt them because I run away. He's dead, Ayanna, James said quietly. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his voice made her look at him directly. Can't hurt you anymore. Can't hurt them. But other men like him. Other men who think Apache women deserve nothing but pain. James was quiet for a moment, understanding the depth of her fear. There are good people in this world too, he said finally. People who believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect. You just haven't met enough of them yet, she studied his face in the moonlight, as if trying to determine whether he was one of those good people or just another man who would eventually reveal his true nature. Why you different? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Hi, Sarah. My wife who died. She taught me that strength isn't about controlling others. It's about protecting them. Your husband confused power with strength. Real strength is what you showed when you walked into that desert with your children, not knowing what you'd find, but knowing you had to try. That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ayanna slept through until dawn without waking in terror. It was a small victory, but in the quiet of the desert night, it felt monumental. 6 months had transformed the McKenna Ranch in ways James never could have imagined. The house that had echoed with loneliness now filled with the sounds of daily life, Kaya's giggles as she played with the kittens, Senna's careful questions as she practiced her reading, and Ayanna's soft humming as she worked in the small garden she'd planted behind the house. The garden had been her idea, a way to contribute something meaningful to their shared life. She'd asked James to help her clear a patch of ground, and together they'd coaxed vegetables and herbs from the stubborn desert soil. Watching her tend to the growing plants, James saw glimpses of the woman she must have been before life had tried to break her spirit. The transformation in Ayanna herself was remarkable. The constant tension in her shoulders had eased, and she no longer flinched when he approached. Her English had improved dramatically through daily conversation, and she'd begun to share stories of her childhood on the reservation. The good memories she'd kept locked away during the dark years of her marriage. My grandmother, she'd teach me about plants, Ayanna told him one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. Which ones heal, which ones help with pain. She'll say Apache women are keepers of old wisdom. James paused in his weeding to look at her. Sounds like your grandmother was a wise woman herself. She'd die when I was 16, before I marry. Ayanna's voice grew sad. She'll tell me, choose man who sees your strength, not one who tries to break it. But my father, he'll already make arrangement with husband's family. I was young, I think maybe love would grow. Did it ever? Grow, I mean? Ayanna shook her head. First time he hit me was our wedding night. Said I was too quiet, not grateful enough. She pulled a weed with more force than necessary. It'd only get worse when daughters came. The casual way she spoke about such horror still made James's chest tighten with anger, but he'd learned to keep that emotion hidden. Ayanna needed his steadiness, not his rage. As autumn approached, James realized he dreaded the thought of them leaving. Ayanna had mentioned several times that they would move on once she'd saved enough money from helping with the ranch work. But the house would feel impossibly empty without them. More than that, he'd grown to care for this small family in ways that both surprised and frightened him. The feeling wasn't one-sided. He'd caught Ayanna watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read, not fear or wariness, but something softer. When he'd injured his hand repairing a fence, she'd tended to the wound with gentle efficiency, her touch lingering longer than strictly necessary. When thunderstorms rolled across the desert, she would sit on the porch with him, no longer needing to position herself for quick escape. The turning point came on a particularly difficult day in October. James had been in town getting supplies when he returned to find Ayanna sitting on the porch steps, a letter crumpled in her hands. Sina was beside her, looking worried, while Kaya played quietly nearby. What is it? James asked, dismounting. From his horse, letter from reservation, Ayanna said, her voice hollow. My husband's brother. He'd say I belong to him now. That children belong to him. He wants us to come back. James felt ice in his veins. Over my dead body? The fierceness in his voice made Ayanna look up in surprise. You not understand? In Apache tradition, brother can claim widow, take children. It is a law of tribe. This isn't the reservation, James said, sitting down beside her. You're not property to be passed from one man to another, and neither are your daughters. But if tribal council decide, the tribal council doesn't have authority here, James interrupted. You chose to leave. You chose to build a new life. That choice matters. Tears began to fall down Ayanna's cheeks. I'm so tired of being afraid, tired of running, but I don't know how to stop. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and she didn't. He gently took her hands in his. You stop by staying. You stop by letting people who care about you help protect what matters most. You care about us? The question was whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it might be true. James looked at this woman who had survived so much, who had found the courage to walk into an uncertain future to save her children. Felt his heart make a decision his mind had been avoiding for months. I love you, he said simply. I love all of you. This house has been empty since Sarah died, but you've brought it back to life. You've brought me back to life. Ayanna stared at him, tears streaming down her face. But I am broken, woman, used. Up, my husband, he say. Your husband lied about everything, James said firmly. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I know. You're beautiful and kind and brave, and anyone who can't see that is blind. For a long moment they sat, in silence while Ayanna processed his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. If we stay, you really want us. All of us. Forever. Forever, James confirmed. If you'll have a stubborn old rancher who talks too much to his horses and burns dinner half the time. Smile that spread across Ayanna's face was like sunrise after the longest night. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly, completely happy. I think, she said carefully, I would like that very much. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, Sina curled up against James's side while Kaya slept in her mother's lap. The silence was comfortable now, filled with possibility rather than fear. Mr. James, Sena said sleepily, are you going to be our papa now? James looked at Ayanna, who nodded with tears of joy in her eyes. If you girls want me to be, I would. Like that, Sena said. Real papas don't hurt their families, do they? Yes, sweetheart, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Real papas protect their families. Always. As the desert wind whispered through the mesquite trees and the distant sound of coyotes echoed across the landscape, Ayanna finally understood what her grandmother had meant about finding a man who saw her strength. She had found not just safety, but love. Not just shelter, but home. The scars would always be there, reminders of the pain she'd endured. But they would fade as all wounds do when tended with kindness. And in their place would grow something beautiful, a family built not on fear, in control, but on respect, love, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing hope over despair. The Apache widow had found her peace at last.